Donovan Parrish had never asked for a shortcut in his life, and the morning he walked into the lobby of Caldwell Structural Holdings, he was not about to start. He had the appointment confirmation printed out and folded in his breast pocket. He had the engineering report in a manila folder, spiral-bound and tabbed, the way his late wife used to organize everything. Methodical, thorough, leaving nothing to chance. He had arrived 11 minutes early because that was the kind of man he was, the kind of man who believed that showing up on time was the least you could do, and showing up early was a way of saying you took things seriously. The receptionist at the front desk looked up when he came through the revolving door. She gave him the kind of smile that had been practiced many times and meant very little. He told her his name. He told her he had a 10 o'clock with the procurement office regarding the Lakeview Bridge tender. She looked at her screen. She looked at it for a while. He waited. He was good at waiting. She told him to take a seat and that someone would be with him shortly. There was a row of low chairs upholstered in gray near the window. He sat in one of them and set the folder on his knee and watched the elevator doors open and close. Donovan was 43 years old. He had spent 20 of those years working with steel and load-bearing math and the kind of structural problems that most people never thought about until something went wrong. He had started as a machinist out of a community college in Sudbury and worked his way into licensed engineering the slow way. Night courses, weekend exams, a decade of learning by doing. He had built a small consulting firm out of a 2-bedroom house in Hamilton, Ontario, with a drafting table in the room that used to be a nursery. His daughter, Wren, was 9 years old and slept in the room next to it, and she knew not to knock when the light under the door was on. Her mother had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless, the way that particular illness tended to be. Donovan did not speak about it often. He had learned that grief, when aired too frequently, made other people uncomfortable, and he was not in the business of making other people uncomfortable. He kept it folded inside him the same way he kept everything. Orderly, managed, accounted for. The Lakeview Bridge tender had taken him 4 months to prepare. It was the largest contract he had ever bid on, a pedestrian and cyclist overpass for a mixed-use development in Burlington backed by a combination of municipal funding and private investment. The lead investor was Caldwell Structural Holdings. The CEO was a man named Theodore Ashford Caldwell. At 10:17, a young man in a lanyard came to collect him. They rode the elevator to the 14th floor in silence. The meeting room had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the escarpment. There were 3 people already seated at the table, 2 junior staff from the procurement team, and at the far end, Theodore Ashford Caldwell himself. Caldwell was in his early 60s with the kind of physical presence that came not from size, but from money. He wore it in the way people wear a second skin when they have had it long enough. He glanced at Donovan, the way you glance at a piece of furniture you are not certain goes with the room. Donovan set the folder on the table and introduced himself by full name and credentials. Caldwell did not introduce himself. He did not need to. One of the junior staff, a woman named Deb, according to her lanyard, pulled up a presentation on the screen at the end of the room. She walked through the shortlisted bids. There were 4 of them. Donovan's was 3rd. When she reached his entry, she paused. She noted the projected cost savings. She noted the material specifications. She noted the load tolerance modeling, which had been independently reviewed by a colleague at McMaster University. Caldwell had not looked at the screen once. He was looking at his phone. Donovan said nothing. He waited. Deb finished. She looked at Donovan and asked if he wanted to add anything. He said he did. He stood up and spoke for 7 minutes without consulting any notes. He talked about the specific soil composition under the Lakeview site and why it affected the foundation anchoring strategy. He talked about the maintenance cost projections over a 20-year cycle. He talked about the local steel supplier he had partnered with in Stony Creek and what that would mean for the project timeline. When he finished, Caldwell put his phone face down on the table. He looked at Donovan the way a man looks at something that has confused him slightly. He said, "Who did you say you were with?" Donovan said. He ran his own firm. He gave the name. Caldwell looked at the junior staff the way a man looks at something he finds mildly absurd. He said the shortlist was for established firms with a project history above a certain threshold. He said there had been a miscommunication somewhere along the process. Donovan said there had been no miscommunication. He said his firm met the threshold and he could provide the documentation if needed. Caldwell leaned back in his chair. He said, "I'm sure you're very good at what you do." He said it the way people say things that mean the opposite of what the words say. He told Deb to have the front desk validate Donovan's parking. Donovan picked up the folder. He said he would leave a copy of the full tender package with the office, as required under the procurement agreement, and that he expected a written record of its receipt. Caldwell had already picked up his phone again. Donovan walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. He waited for the doors to close before he let out a long, slow breath through his nose. He was not surprised. He had been in rooms like that before. Rooms where the decision was made before anyone sat down, where the process was a performance staged for legal cover. What surprised him slightly was how openly Caldwell had done it. No pretense of reviewing the documentation, no effort at the choreography of fairness. He picked up Wren from school that afternoon. She had made something in art class. A small clay figure of a horse, lopsided and earnest, the legs not quite matching. She held it carefully in both hands on the drive home and told him about the teacher who said it was very creative, which she explained meant the teacher did not know what it was supposed to be. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere uncomplicated. He made her dinner. He helped with the worksheet on fractions. He put her to bed and sat for a while in the room next to hers, with the light on. Then he opened the procurement agreement on his screen and read through it again. The terms were specific. The review period was 30 days from the date of shortlist notification. Each shortlisted firm was entitled to written evaluation feedback upon request. Any withdrawal of a shortlisted firm without documentation of noncompliance was subject to a review clause under Ontario's Public-Private Procurement Guidelines, a clause that had been written into the contract because the municipal funding component required it. Donovan had read this before. He had read it many times. He had read it knowing that rooms like the one on the 14th floor existed, knowing that men like Theodore Ashford Caldwell existed, knowing that the contract alone would not protect him unless he used it correctly. He had been preparing for a long time. Over the next 2 weeks, he made 2 phone calls and sent a series of emails. The first call was to the Infrastructure Ontario Complaints Office, which handled disputes related to public-funded procurement processes. He identified himself, provided his firm's registration number, and submitted a formal notice of concern regarding procedural irregularities in the Lakeview Bridge Ender. He was careful with his language. He used the specific terminology from the procurement guidelines. He asked for a file number and wrote it down. The second call was to a reporter at the Hamilton Spectator named Yusuf, who covered municipal infrastructure and had written 2 pieces in the past 18 months about irregularities in Burlington area contracting. Donovan did not call to give an interview. He called to ask, as a reader, whether Yusuf was still covering that beat. Yusuf said he was. Donovan thanked him and ended the call. The emails were to Deb, the procurement coordinator, requesting formal written confirmation of receipt of his tender package. The responses he received were vague, delayed, and twice referenced documents that had not been sent to him. He archived each one with timestamps. He did not tell anyone what he was doing. Not his neighbor, who sometimes watched Wren after school. Not his accountant. Not his old colleague from Sudbury, who called once a week on Sunday evenings. He went about his work and his routines, and the ordinary architecture of a life that had been built out of ordinary days, and he kept the rest of it in a separate, very quiet place. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the meeting on the 14th floor, He drove to the Burlington municipal offices and filed a formal written complaint with the office of the city's procurement oversight officer. He brought 2 copies of everything, one to submit and one to retain. He asked the clerk to date stamp his copies. She did. He thanked her by name because he had taken the time to learn it. At noon of the same day, he received a phone call from someone at Caldwell Structural Holdings, who identified herself as being from the legal team. She said the company was aware of the complaint and wanted to clarify a few points before anything went further. She had a tone that was professionally warm and structurally firm, like a wall with upholstery on it. Donovan listened. He said he appreciated the call. He said his submission was a matter of documented record and that he had nothing further to add at this stage. She paused. She said that Mr. Caldwell wanted him to understand that the procurement process had followed all required guidelines. Donovan said he was sure the review process would confirm that one way or the other. There was another pause. She thanked him for his time. He said, of course. He ended the call and went to pick up Ren from school. Ren was working on a project about Canadian rivers for her geography class. She had chosen the Credit River because she liked the name. On Saturday morning, she sat at the kitchen table with a printed map and a box of colored pencils and drew the tributaries with careful, small hands. Donovan made pancakes. He put blueberries in some and not others because she preferred them separate so she could control the ratio. She asked him what a tributary was. Exactly. He explained it. She said it was like a team, with the small rivers being the teammates and the big river being the one who carried everything to the end. He said that was actually an excellent way to think about it. She seemed satisfied with this and went back to her coloring. He stood at the counter for a moment and watched her. Whatever happened with the contract, whatever came next, whatever Caldwell did or didn't do, this was the part that was real. The kitchen, the blueberries on the side, the small hands on the map. He let himself feel it, and then he turned back to the stove. The Infrastructure Ontario file moved slowly, the way institutional processes always did, but it moved. Donovan received a formal acknowledgement within 10 days of his submission. The acknowledgement noted that a preliminary review had been initiated. He printed it and put it in the folder. What he had not anticipated, or perhaps had anticipated but not calculated the timing of, was what happened inside Caldwell Structural Holdings during those weeks. Caldwell had built his company over 30 years. It was well capitalized, well connected, and its board included 2 former provincial cabinet ministers and a retired deputy city manager from Mississauga. It had won significant public contracts for 2 consecutive decades by being, as the company described itself in its annual reports, a trusted partner to government infrastructure. What the annual reports did not describe, because annual reports rarely describe the architecture of a thing accurately, was the nature of that trust. Infrastructure Ontario's preliminary review flagged 2 things. The first was the procedural gap Donovan had documented. The failure to provide written evaluation criteria in advance of the shortlist stage, which was a technical non-compliance under the procurement guidelines. The second was something the investigators found during their initial file review that Donovan had not put there. A pattern in 3 previous Caldwell contracts where shortlisted small firms had been dismissed with procedurally thin documentation, in each case resulting in the contract being awarded to a company with a directorship that shared a member with Caldwell's own board. Donovan did not know about this when it was found. He learned about it later, the way you learn about the underneath of a stone after someone has already turned it over. What he did know was that on a Thursday afternoon in early November, he received a call from the Infrastructure Ontario Review Coordinator, who told him that the preliminary findings had been escalated to a formal audit and that the Lakeview Bridge contract had been placed on administrative hold pending the outcome. She told him this in a tone that was careful and precise and contained nothing he could interpret as a prediction. He thanked her. He wrote down the date. That evening, Yusuf from the Hamilton Spectator called him. Donovan had not contacted him again since the first call. Yusuf said he had been following the Infrastructure Ontario filings through the public register and had seen Donovan's firm name come up in relation to the Lakeview hold. He asked if Donovan would be willing to speak to him. Donovan said he would speak to him about the procurement process and his experience as a small firm navigating public tender. He said he would not speculate about the larger investigation. He said he would like to see a draft of any quotes attributed to him before publication. Yusuf agreed to this. The article ran 12 days later. It was not a front-page piece. It was on page 4 of the city section, below the fold. The headline referenced the administrative hold on the Lakeview contract and the audit. Donovan's name appeared twice. Both times, what he was quoted as saying was straightforward, measured, and entirely consistent with what he had documented. The article was, by the standards of Hamilton Spectator, page 4 pieces, unremarkable. But it was picked up by 2 regional infrastructure news outlets, and then it was picked up by a column in the Toronto Star that covered municipal procurement irregularities. And the column was noticed by a member of the Ontario Legislature who sat on the Standing Committee for Public Accounts and who had been looking for a case study. None of this happened because Donovan had planned it. He had not planned a cascade. He had filed a complaint because the process had a mechanism for complaints, and because the contract had public money in it, and because he believed, with the same methodical, unglamorous belief that he brought to structural load tolerances, that mechanisms existed to be used. By December, the formal audit had expanded to cover 5 additional contracts over a 7-year period. Theodore Ashford Caldwell had retained a firm of lawyers whose names appeared frequently in relation to white-collar regulatory matters. The company's stock had declined 17% over 6 weeks. One of the 2 former cabinet ministers on the board had quietly resigned. Donovan received a call from Caldwell's legal team again, from the same woman as before. Her tone had changed. The upholstery was still there, but the wall behind it felt different. She said the company wanted to resolve the Lakeview matter quickly and asked whether Donovan would be open to a conversation. He said he was always open to conversations conducted within appropriate channels. He gave her the name of the procurement mediator he had retained for this purpose. He said all further communication should go through her. She said, of course. He ended the call. Wren had a school concert in the 3rd week of December. She played the recorder in a group of 12 children who had been practicing O Canada and Jingle Bells since October. She wore a red sweater that had belonged to her mother, which Donovan had found in a box in the closet last winter and washed carefully and put away for an occasion that seemed appropriate. He sat in the 3rd row of the school gymnasium with the other parents. He watched Wren find him in the crowd when she walked on stage. She raised her eyebrows slightly, the way she did when she was trying not to smile. He raised his eyebrows back. The recorder rendition of O Canada was imperfect and sincere and exactly as long as it needed to be. He drove her home through streets that had gotten their first snow of the season, quiet and white at the edges. She told him about which of her friends had been nervous, and which ones had breathed wrong into the recorder and whether she had breathed wrong too. He said he had not noticed. She said she thought she maybe had slightly on the last note. He said the last note had sounded fine. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Dad, what does it mean when something is under audit?" He looked at her briefly and then back at the road. He said it was when someone checks carefully to make sure everything was done the right way. She said, "And what happens if it wasn't?" He said people made it right, or tried to. She thought about this for a while. Then she said, "And what if the person who did it wrong is very powerful?" He said it took longer, but that it still happened. She seemed to accept this. She looked out the window at the snow. He kept his eyes on the road and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The formal resolution of the Lakeview procurement matter came in February. The contract was re-tendered under new guidelines drafted in partial response to the Infrastructure Ontario audit findings. Donovan submitted again. The second process was longer and involved 2 additional review stages that had not existed before. His firm was awarded the contract in April. He did not find out in a phone call. He found out in a letter, formal and plain, with the municipal crest in the upper left corner. He read it at the kitchen table in the morning before Wren was awake. He read it once and then set it down and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. Then he got up and made her breakfast. He told her that evening, after homework, in the way he told her most things, without fanfare, with the facts presented straight and the feeling left for her to find in them. He said his company had been chosen to build the bridge. She said, "The one you were working on for a really long time?" He said yes. She said, "Because you did it right?" He said he hoped so. He said it was hard to know exactly why things worked out sometimes, and he didn't want her to think it was simple, because it wasn't. She nodded like someone who had already understood this and was waiting for him to catch up. "But it worked out," she said. He said it did. She went back to her homework. He sat across from her at the table and opened his own files, and they worked in parallel in the way they had learned to work, side by side, the small lamp on between them, neither needing to say anything more. The bridge opened the following autumn. It was not a large ceremony. A ribbon, a few remarks from a city councillor, a modest write-up in the local paper. The structure itself was clean and functional, the lines of it doing what good engineering does, making something difficult look, from the outside, like it had always been easy. Donovan stood off to one side during the remarks. Wren stood next to him, her hand in his, watching the small crowd. He thought about the 14th floor. He thought about the gray chairs by the window and the folder on his knee, and the man who had not looked up from his phone. He did not feel triumphant. Triumph was not the right word for what he felt. It was something quieter and more durable than that. The feeling of having done something the correct way when it would have been easier and faster and certainly less expensive to do it another way, and of having arrived at the end of that path and found it solid under his feet. Wren tugged his hand. She pointed to the railing of the bridge, where someone had already chained a bicycle. "It's being used," she said, like this was the most important part. He looked at the bicycle. He looked at the bridge. He said, "Yeah, that's the whole point."